Hi boys and girls, it's Mrs. J. Thanks for joining me today. I have another fraction lesson for you. We know that we all did a little bit of a fraction lesson earlier in the week. I hope you were able to look at the video and practice some fractions and refresh your memory a little bit about what fractions are and what they represent and how we show them. Just to give you a little update before we start, a refresher. Remember that we're always talking about equal pieces, equal size pieces when we're talking about pieces in a fraction. Remember, we can't have some things that are cut into little teeny tiny pieces and then other pieces be really big, because that doesn't make any sense. So we always talk about equal pieces. You also want to remember the two numbers in a fraction. The numerator is the number on top. That tells us how many pieces we're talking about. And the number on the bottom, the denominator, tells us how many pieces are in the whole altogether. So how many equal pieces is whatever it is cut into or sectioned off into. We also talked about fraction bars. Remember, we had a bar, and then the denominator would tell us how many equal pieces we needed in that bar, and then the numerator would tell us how many we had to shade. We also talked about fractions on a number line. We talked about measuring out equally the spaces to mark the points, and then jumping ahead to mark the point for the fraction that we were specifically looking for. So today, to follow up, we'll be talking about a specific kind of fraction, a unit fraction. And we're going to be talking about comparing unit fractions. Now, before we start, I just really want to hit home that you have it in your brain that we have to be talking about not only equal pieces in the shape when something is divided up, but we also need to be talking about equal sized objects. Okay, so we can't be talking about a little small pizza and a big pizza, but I have an even better example for you. So let's say Connor and Kenzie said to me, "Mom, can I eat half the cheese balls?" And I said, "Sure, go ahead." Okay, so let's pretend that Kenzie was talking about this many cheese balls. So she wanted to eat half of the cheese balls. That's reasonable, right? That's a good snack. Let's say Connor said, "Mom, can I eat half the cheese balls?" And he had this many. Not the same. First of all, number one, Connor's going to be in trouble. And number two, he's going to have a stomachache. Okay? This half would not be equal to this half. Because of the difference in the size of the objects, we can't really compare them fairly. So if we had 1/2 equals 1/2, that would make no sense. Or if an amount in this jar was bigger than this jar, it wouldn't really be a fair comparison. So you need to remember that when we're talking about objects of the same size, when we're talking about comparing fractions, you need to think about either two bags of something the same size, two cakes the same size, two candy bars the same size, two cookies the same size, whatever it might be. We're talking about something that's cut into equal pieces of an object that's the same size, okay? No ginormous tubs of cheese balls. Not okay. So anyway, so let's get on to our lesson with comparing fractions. Unit fractions specifically. And remember, a unit fraction, we'll stop right there. A unit fraction is a fraction whose numerator is always 1. And that's because we're just talking about one piece. What's the size of one piece of that fraction? And it shows one equal part of a whole. So my first whole I have divided into 4 pieces. And this whole I have divided into 8 pieces. Now I measured these very carefully. These rectangles are exactly the same size. So we're talking about 2 equal shapes, and then each of the pieces within the shape are cut into equal pieces. So my unit fraction here is 1/4. You can see the size of the space that 1/4 takes up versus the size that 1/8 takes up. The 1/8 pieces are definitely smaller, aren't they? And that's one thing that you need to remember, and sometimes it gets a little tricky. We talked about this in school a little bit before we left for our break, about remembering what exactly a denominator means. Just because the denominator is bigger doesn't mean that the size is bigger. It's actually the opposite, which can be a little confusing, and you have to remember and think about it on your own. So let's go down a little bit farther. So as the denominator decreases, so as we have a smaller denominator, the size of the unit fraction increases. And you can see here I originally had this flip-flop because I copied the definition out of the math book to make sure it was accurate. I mean, I knew it was, but as I was teaching the lesson in my head and thinking about how I wanted to say things, I kept realizing that I kept thinking in my head, as the denominator decreases, the sizes get bigger. I just kept saying it that way. So I flipped that so that it would make sense to you, because in reverse it makes the same way too, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to comparing fractions, and I think it'll be easier for you to understand. But you need to keep it in your head, the smaller the denominator, the bigger the pieces. Not how many there are. We're not talking about the amount, the quantity. We're talking about the size of one individual piece. And I think if you look at the 1/4 piece and the 1/8 piece, you can see that even though this denominator is bigger, the size of each piece is smaller, because it has to be smaller to be able to fit that many pieces in the same size object. Now, the way that we'll compare unit fractions, and this should be familiar to you also, we're going to use the symbols greater than, less than, and we do have equal to, but we won't use that very often because it's just too easy. Okay, like if I said to you 1/3 versus 1/3 equal, 1/5 versus 1/5 equal. So easy peasy. You guys can do that. So let's take a look at a couple examples that I have for you. Put the paper right there, and let's talk about some of the fractions. I think you can see those at the bottom of the paper. Okay, so this is the example that I had for my rectangles up at the top. So, sorry, my chart paper's falling to the floor. If I have 1/4 compared to 1/8, correctly in the right order, I would say 1/4 is greater than 1/8, because the size of the space that 1/4 takes up is bigger than the size of the space that 1/8 takes up. So if the fractions are in this order, my correct symbol would be greater than. If I were to flip-flop those fractions, I would have to use the opposite symbol, because to make that a true statement, I would have to say 1/8 is less than 1/4, because 1/8 is smaller than 1/4. I couldn't still have greater than there because that wouldn't make sense, because 1/8 is not bigger than 1/4. So depending on which way you flip fractions, the greater than and the less than symbol can also flip-flop depending on which way the fractions are to make that a true statement. So let's do a couple fractions that I have for you just for practice. I have 1/3 compared to 1/7. And I think in school we used to always say versus. I don't know, we liked versus. So 1/3 versus 1/7. So which fraction is bigger? That's the first thing I always want to think of in my head. And you always want to remember, so the smaller number has the bigger sized piece. So if something's cut into 3 pieces, those pieces will be bigger than something that's cut into 7 pieces. So 1/3 would be greater than 1/7. Now I have 1/8 and I have 1/5. If I think about something that's cut into 8 pieces and I think about something that's cut into 5 pieces, the shape that's cut into 5 pieces will have the bigger pieces. So remember, the smaller the denominator, the bigger the piece. So I would make, and this is the one thing that we talked about also, it's easier to make the greater than or less than symbol go the right way first, because you want to find the piece that's bigger. But remember, then you have to be able to read it properly in the correct order. So even though 1/5 is bigger, we know that, we figured that out, you would have to say 1/8 is less than 1/5 to make that make sense. Okay? My next fraction, 1/6 compared to 1/2. So 1/6 of something versus a half of something. The half would be bigger. Even though the denominator, the 2, is smaller, that means the size of the piece is bigger. So I would make my symbol go towards the 1/2, And to properly read that, I would say 1/6 is less than 1/2. My last example, I have 1/3 versus 1/4. So that's pretty close. Something cut into 3 pieces and something cut into 4 pieces. But something that only has 3 pieces is going to be a little teeny tiny bit bigger than something cut into 4 pieces. So 1/3, and I would make my symbol going that way towards the 1/3. 1/3 is greater than 1/4. Okay, so those are a couple things that I need you to remember about unit fractions. Now to practice this, I made a fun little activity, and all you're going to need, and you can do this on your own sometime after the video. So let me put some paper back up so I have something to write on. Okay, excuse me while I stand up. All right, and I did write this little phrase out to help you remember. Can you see that? Okay. The smaller the denominator, the bigger the piece. So think about that. So what I did is I just took a white piece of paper and I cut out little squares, and on the squares I started at 1/2 and I went all the way up to 1/20. And I wrote the unit fraction. So you can see I have 1/12, I have 1/6, I have 1/15, 1/14. I've got them all here. 1/17, 18th, 1/4, 1/7, 1/8. So there's 1/3. I've got all the fractions from 1/2 to 1/20. And this is a really easy way for you to be able to practice comparing fractions. So what I'll do, you know I'm really good at this, mixing up, and not looking, I'm not going to look, and I'm just going to pick 2 fractions, and I'm going to look at them in the order that I pick them out. So I have 1/18 compared to 1/6. So that's what I'll do. So I use those, I can put them down. So now I'm going to think, I have something cut into 18 pieces, which is a lot of pieces, but they'd have to be really small, versus something cut into 6 pieces. Which would have the bigger piece? 1/18 or 1/6? Well, the smaller the denominator, the bigger the piece. So I would make my comparing symbol go towards the 1/6, but now remember, if I have to read that properly, I have to say 1/18 is less than 1/6. So let's try another one, just for fun. Let's say, let's see what I pick. Okay, I have 1/7 and 1/14. So let me write those down. I grabbed a purple marker this time. 1/7 and 1/14. So you want to think about an object that's cut into 7 pieces and an object that's cut into 14 pieces. Which would have the single bigger piece? It would be 1/7. And to say that properly, I would say 1/7 is greater than 1/14. Okay, let's do one more. We'll do it really quick. One more. 3 is a nice number of examples. Ooh, good one. Okay, I have 1/4 versus 1/2. So 2 fractions, both with pretty small denominators. So let's write that down. 1/4 and 1/2. So I'm going to think about a candy bar. If you shared that candy bar with 4 people, or if you shared that candy bar with only 2 people, if you split it in half, how are you going to get a bigger piece? You're going to get a bigger piece if you divide that whole into just 2 pieces. So the half is a bigger. But you would read it as 1/4 is less than 1/2. That's how you'd read that properly. So if you want to practice comparing unit fractions, you can do that on your own. I just simply took some computer paper and just started cutting it up, and I went from 1/2 to 1/20. I stopped at 1/20 because I don't know, I thought I had enough and my marker was getting dried up, but that would be a perfectly normal amount of pieces. If you want to start out with some less unit fractions, you can just do 1/2 to 1/12. You could do 1/2 to 1/8 if you wanted to start with a smaller amount first and then kind of work your way up. You can make as many unit fractions as you like. But that's a really great way to practice randomly, just picking some fractions. And you just need to remember that the smaller the denominator, the bigger the piece. So thanks for joining me. This is just one of many lessons that we're going to be doing in fractions to keep continuing our learning. And I hope you're having fun with it, and I hope you're learning at home and you're practicing your fractions. Thanks. I'll see you soon. Bye.